Alright guys, so I recently made a video outlining my path to success on the USMLE Step 1, and I gave you my personal advice on how you should create your study strategies. However, my personal advice, like anybody's advice, is inherently subject to bias. So the purpose of this video is to provide the evidence regarding the subject and give you all the tools you need to decide for yourself what study strategies you want to employ to set you up for the optimal performance on Step 1. So there has been some research done specifically regarding Step 1 and what study strategies allow some students to perform better than others, so I'll briefly go over that. But that leaves some important things out. So I'll also share with you a little bit more about what we know about learning and how we can possibly apply that to our Step 1 study strategies. And finally, I'll put all this theory into practice and give you my final recommendations on how you should create your study strategies and your study schedules. So the first study I'm going to go over was done at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in 2011. It was a presentation titled, "Are Questions the Answer? The Effect of Popular Study Resources on USMLE Step 1 Performance." They had some pretty important findings, one of which is that baseline academic ability was strongly associated with Step 1 performance. This is something we pretty much already knew. One thing about standardized examinations are they are extremely effective in predicting performance on other standardized examinations. Other aspects of performance, maybe not, but they're very good at predicting your success on standardized exams in the future. So it comes as no surprise that the people who are inclined to do well on the MCAT are also inclined to do on Step 1, and people who are succeeding in their basic science courses are also at an advantage when it comes to Step 1. This is nice to know. We pretty much already knew it, but it's not really useful for you to know because you can't change it at this point. You can't go back and change your MCAT score. Your baseline academic ability, because of the baseline, you can't change that. You can improve upon it, but this is something they found they already expected, but it doesn't really aid you in creating your study strategies. So what are the modifiable variables they found? Interestingly, total hours studied was not correlated at all with Step 1 performance. Very close to zero on the Pearson coefficient there. What does this mean? Does this mean you shouldn't work hard and study a lot? Not really, but it does mean that the reason some students performed better than others was not because they were putting in more hours, but it was because of the methods they were using. And really the main method identified in this study as a predictor of Step 1 performance is the number of practice questions completed. Now, obviously, this is something I've talked a lot about in my previous videos, but practice questions truly are the most important aspect of your study strategy, and this was kind of the first study to share that information with us. So, significant p-value, yes, practice questions are correlated with Step 1 performance. What else did they say? This correlation between number of practice questions performed and Step 1 performance was not explained by basic science course average, by MCAT score, or by total hours of studying. It was independently correlated with Step 1 performance, which is very important. The number they quoted was a 1-point increase per 200 questions performed. That would be nice if it was cut and dry like that. I wouldn't worry too much about that number. One thing about it, in 2011, when this study was performed, the number they shared for average number of questions performed by their students was a little over 2,000. So yeah, it makes sense that 200 questions is, almost increasing your total number of questions by 10% or so. So yeah, you can expect some pretty rapid increase. Today, it's probably closer to 4,000 or 5,000. So I don't think that number holds true as you do more and more questions. That extra point becomes harder and harder to get, the law of diminishing returns. But it is a nice number, and it helps you set your goals, and it's something to kind of plan around, and it shows you that this is actually working. There were no significant effects of non-question resources in relation to Step 1 performance. Importantly, Anki was not studied. I'll get to that later. And all but one student in this study used first aid as a resource. So essentially, there was no good way to correlate that since everybody, or almost everybody, was already using it. So they didn't find an association with that, but they didn't necessarily expect one based on the demographics of their study. And one of the really neat things about this study is they actually implemented this and found a significant increase in score of their students. So basically, they told their class, hey, look what we found. Questions are really important to study for step one. And they told everybody, do a lot of questions while you're studying. And they actually moved the average up by 3 or 4 points in this intervention. And it really shows you that they're not just looking back and saying, oh, it looks like people who did well did a lot of questions. But they can actually say, we told people to do a lot of questions and we saw an increase in their score, which really reflects my advice, and questions are the most important way to study. I tell you to do questions, you will see an increase in your scores as you complete them. Okay, so that was kind of the initial study, and there have been more studies done after that. This one was from students of the University of Michigan between 2014 and 2015, titled Study Behaviors in USMLE Step 1 Performance, Implications of a Student Self-Directed Parallel Curriculum. So again, they found kind of the same things. Baseline academic ability was associated with step 1 success, no surprise there. But again, we're looking for modifiable variables. So score goal, your goal score was significantly associated with how well you performed on step 1, which is good news. So I can tell you, hey, set a high goal, you'll do better. That's comforting and it's easy to implement. Early studying. Essentially what they meant by this is at the time, their preclinical curriculum was not necessarily directed toward the step 1 examination. They weren't teaching toward the test, so to speak. So they found that the students that engaged in a parallel curriculum while they were going along with their preclinical classes, but at the same time beginning their step 1 studying, they did significantly better than those who only focused on their preclinical courses. So bottom line there is start studying for step 1 early. You'll do better. Again, study hours per day was not significantly associated with success on the examination. Again, reflecting that it's not how much you study, it's your method of studying that's going to help you excel in this examination. What else? First aid. They found that 3 or more passes of first aid was significantly associated with step 1 success compared to students who did 2 or fewer passes of first aid. I feel kind of defeated as I'm saying that because I chose not to use first aid. I don't really like the way information is presented in first aid. It's a lot of facts and charts and tables and not a whole lot of context, which is not really the way that I learn. So I don't personally recommend it, or I didn't personally recommend it, but I can't really argue with this evidence. And it seems pretty clear that 3 or more passes in first aid did have a very significant association with step 1 success. But the other things they found were unique practice questions were also strongly associated with step 1 success, as was found in the past. And repeat practice questions were also associated with success. However, the authors noted that unique practice questions were a better study strategy than repeat practice question based on their data. And this is something that I mentioned in my previous video. I would say I didn't do a whole lot of repeat practice questions. I would say unique practice questions are better, because as you start to repeat practice questions, you're seeing the same vignettes. It kind of jogs your memory, and you're really not getting the same active learning experience as you do with a totally novel practice question. The next study was done at Washington University in St. Louis in 2015. Student-directed retrieval practice is a predictor of medical licensing examination performance. Again, MCAT honors, baseline academic ability associated with step 1 success, but we're interested in modifiable variables. Again, practice questions strongly associated with success. 1, 2, 3, they all found it. Check that off your list. You need to be doing practice questions as a primary means of studying for this examination. This one's interesting because they specifically looked at Anki in relation to performance on the examination, and they found a significant correlation between the number of unique Anki cards performed and performance on step 1. Again, not something that I wanted to see because I didn't personally use Anki, and I don't necessarily recommend it. It's okay if you want to use it, but I think questions are far more important. But I can't argue with the evidence. They did find a significant correlation between Anki cards and performance on step 1. One of the interesting things, though, is that they did not find a significant correlation between firecracker cards and questions performed and performance on step 1, which is really interesting to me because in a way, the Anki system and the firecracker system are both kind of based on this spaced repetition principle to kind of strengthen memories by spacing them out and having that repetition over and over again. but Anki was shown to be correlated with success while Firecracker wasn't, with a Pearson correlation near 0 and a p-value of 0.5, not even close. So I think that's interesting that this is what the study found, and it wasn't necessarily explained by the authors, and it's something that would be difficult to explain. Not to hate on Firecracker, according to their website, they have a 234 average for people who use Firecracker versus a 227 average of people who didn't use it. Now, I don't know the strength and the quality of their data, but I guess it is worth mentioning, although it wasn't found to be true in this particular study done at WashU. And then the number they reported is completing an additional 445 board-style practice questions or 1,700 unique Anki flashcards was associated with 1 additional point on step 1. And you kind of notice a trend. In 2011, Einstein College of Medicine said 200 additional practice questions. In 2015, WashU was saying 445 additional practice questions. And that number is going to keep growing as students are doing more and more practice questions and getting more efficient at taking this examination. One other thing that's important to note from this study, they found that depression and anxiety were significant negative predictors of step 1 scores. It's not particularly the focus of this talk, but it is worth bringing up. So, take care of yourself, cook yourself decent food, work out every day if you can, 6 days a week if you can. And if you're really struggling with something and going through a tough time, don't be afraid to speak up and try to get some help. Most institutions have really good resources to help students through tough times. So I encourage you not to keep anything bottled up, and if you're really going through something, to speak up. So that was the research I chose to present specifically related to performance on step 1. So that's a very high level of evidence. To recap, questions are the common denominator that every study has shown significantly improves performance on the exam, so it should be a foundational aspect of your study strategies. First aid was shown in 1 to be successful, 3 or more passes versus 2 or fewer, and Anki was shown at WashU to be also correlated with success on step 1, but I'll explain more about the theory behind that as I go. So what else do we know about learning, just in general, not necessarily in reference to step 1? Well, something you've probably all seen before is the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, and it's this concept of spaced repetition, how if you space out the time interval with which you review a topic, the memory gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And this is essentially how the Anki and Firecracker algorithms work. They present you with a flashcard, and then they'll present it again at a certain time interval. And if you keep getting it right, that time interval grows and grows and grows, assuming that your memory gets stronger and stronger and stronger. One important thing not to forget, though, is if you're doing practice questions on random, you're also getting this spaced repetition. It's not necessarily in the format of this, algorithmic forgetting curve, but you're not necessarily at a disadvantage if you choose not to do Anki or Firecracker and simply do random practice questions in terms of the spaced repetition concept. What else do we know? The testing effect. You guys are probably also familiar with this. The more you practice testing the information you know and have that active learning, the better your long-term retention rates and your transfer and application is going to be. And I cited some studies. You can read those on your own if you'd like. So again, Anki, Firecracker, practice questions, they all involve this testing effect where you have to generate the knowledge and you're consistently testing yourself on what you do and don't know, and that will help you learn faster and will help your transfer and application rates. What else do we know? Now we get into some differentiation between the flashcards versus the practice questions. This concept of rote versus conceptual memory. So rote memory is kind of just regurgitating a fact, something, free recall you've memorized off the top of your head, whereas conceptual memory is a little deeper, and it's about integration of one topic with other related topics. So the concept says that context-rich memories are stronger and longer lasting than context-poor memories. And this is one of the main reasons that I encourage questions over flashcards like Anki, because questions are very context-rich. Each one gives you a vignette with a lot of context, and it gives you an explanation with a lot of context, whereas flashcards give you the same short cue over and over again with the same answer, so relatively context poor. So I say questions greater than flashcards with 3 question marks because this hasn't been shown to be true specifically in regard to step 1. This is applying theory into practice here. Based on this theory, I would expect questions to be greater than flashcards. The ultimate question is, yes, Anki works, but would the time invested in doing Anki flashcards be better used doing practice questions? It would be great if we had a clear answer to that, but we don't. So in my mind, based on this concept, I think practice questions are going to give you stronger memories and better transfer and application of knowledge into novel situations like step 1. And then just to kind of close things out with this, this is a paper that you can read if you like, Improving Students' Learning with Effective Learning Techniques. It kind of goes over the 10 more common ways of learning, and it reviews the literature and says, these are high utility versus these are low utility. And essentially what they find, the high utility study strategies are practice testing, like I've been saying, and distributed practice, like I've been saying. Okay, whereas the low utility methods are rereading and highlighting and various other things. And this is one of the reasons that the students of Michigan were found to perform better when they did 3 or more passes of first aid. It was surprising to me because that seems like it would fall into the low utility category of rereading and highlighting and just going over first aid over and over again. Now, I know there are many different strategies to use first aid, and in my mind, you can kind of elevate that from rereading and highlighting to the moderate utility methods of, elaboration, interleaving, self-explanation. But you're still missing out on the highest efficacy practices that we know, which is essentially practice testing, and something that you simply don't get from first aid. And based on this, I chose not to use first aid as a study strategy, and it has been shown in that one study to be beneficial, but I still don't think that you're going to be missing out a whole lot if you choose not to use first aid as extensively as 3 or more, 5 or more, 10 or more passes through it. I think practice questions are a better use of your time based on this theory. Again, not necessarily based on evidence specifically pertaining to step 1, but based on theory. That's my recommendation. And this is what I'm really excited to talk about, this concept of desirable difficulties. This term was coined by Robert Bjork in 1994. And essentially he says that learning is most effective when the student is forced to generate the answer, solution, or procedure. This is essentially what we know as active learning. And this goes along with the testing effect. You need to force yourself to answer questions rather than simply reading through information as you would in first aid. So this was really important because it essentially reversed everything we thought we knew about learning. So in the past, the dogma was learn, rehearse, review, and then test. But what this is saying, along with the testing effect, is that testing needs to be a primary means of studying so that you're testing, learning, and reviewing all at the same time, which allows you to perform when the test actually matters. So why isn't everybody doing this? Well, he has an answer to that. So this method of learning actually slows down apparent learning, but aids in long-term retention, transfer, and application of information. For example, if you took one student and told them to read a segment of first aid over and over and over, 5 times over, you took a different student and you gave them a bunch of practice questions on the same topic over the same amount of time, the student who read first aid would say, yes, I feel like I've mastered this information, I'm ready to be tested, while the student who was doing practice questions would say, I'm realizing everything I don't understand, and I don't necessarily feel ready to be tested on this information. However, the student who did the practice questions will consistently outperform the student who simply read the information long term. And what he says about this is that when you're reviewing and you're rereading, you're gaining a lot of familiarity with the material. If you read first aid 10 times over, you become very familiar with it. You can become familiar with the cues, you become familiar with the order of the information presented, and you can actually confuse that for having a solid understanding of the material. But as you know, if you've done questions, you're consistently reminded of everything you don't know. Every time you get a question wrong, which at the beginning is very often, you're consistently reminded that you don't know this bit of information. You weren't able to apply this bit of information. You weren't able to figure out the diagnosis based on this vignette. And you're constantly having these reminders that no, you're not a master of this information yet, which is actually good in terms of long-term studying and performance on the exam. So here you can pause right now and read some of these if you'd like. These are some of the things he says about this concept of desirable difficulty and how it differs from apparent learning that you would get if you just read the information all at once. So what actually constitutes a desirable difficulty? One of the things Bjork brings up is varying the learning cues and context. So again, this is another reason I like questions over flashcard systems, because every question you get has a different vignette. It's got a different question, it's got different answer choices. And even if you're being tested on the same thing, the context and the cues that you're getting are constantly changing. And that will actually lead to stronger memories and better retention rates and better long-term performance. So again, I say questions greater than Anki, 3 question marks. We don't know this specifically in reference to step 1, but it seems, judging by this theory, that may be true. And yet another reason that my advice is questions are superior to Anki given the same amount of time. What else? Interleaving is greater than blocking. Interleaving is kind of studying a bunch of different subjects all throughout, rather than blocking being study one subject until you feel like you've mastered it, move on to the next, until you feel like you've mastered it, move on to the next, move on to the next. And interestingly, what he shows, as you can see in these panels, on the left panel, students predicted that they would perform better if they blocked their subjects and studied one subject to mastery before moving on. However, their actual performance was completely opposite. The vast majority of students did better interleaving the subjects rather than blocking them. So what this tells me is that random questions are going to be greater than blocked questions when you're doing your preparation in your question banks. And this is a question I get a lot, but I strongly recommend doing questions on random. Again, not necessarily shown to be the right way to do things in reference to step 1, but it's a logical inference that based on this principle that would also be true. So yes, I encourage doing questions on random. And a quick aside, let's think for a second how most medical schools work. So at my institution, we learn one discipline for 4 weeks or so, and we move on to the next, and then we get to systems, and we learn one system for 4 weeks and move on to the next system and the next and the next until we've covered everything, and now we're masters of medicine. Except we know, and we've known for a while now, that is not the ideal situation for long-term retention of information. Instead, we should be consistently interleaving the information. So maybe sometime in the future we can implement that into our curriculum. But I digress. That's not for me to decide right now. Here's a explanation that he gives based on this principle. I like it. You can pause and read it if you'd like. And then here's a question I get all the time. Essentially, every time I share my study strategies, I get this question. What about subjects I haven't learned yet? Should I still be doing questions on systems and disciplines that I'm not familiar with? Let's see what Bjork says about this. If, however, the learner does not have the background knowledge or skills to respond to them successfully, they become undesirable difficulties. Okay? So yes, I recommend doing questions that you haven't studied yet. And you may say, look, I got you. You're wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. But I can explain. Here's how I interpret this. I'll give you an example. If I give you a question on quantum physics, you'll probably get the answer wrong. And if I give you an explanation in the language of quantum physics, you probably won't be able to understand it, and you probably won't learn very much because you don't have the tools and the background knowledge necessary to learn from it. In the same way, if I asked you a question about medicine, but I asked it in French, assuming you don't know French, you wouldn't be able to answer it. And if I gave you an explanation in French, you wouldn't be able to learn from it because obviously you don't have the tools with which to interpret the answer in the explanation. Obviously, those are very extreme examples, but the point I'm trying to make is even though it seems like when we step foot in medical school that we know nothing, that simply isn't the case. Most of us do have a strong background in biochemistry and physiology, essentially because those were topics heavily tested on MCAT. And since we've made it this far, it's probably safe to assume that most of us did reasonably well on the MCAT and we have a little bit of background knowledge. So even though we're getting questions wrong, we do have the tools necessary to interpret the answer, to interpret the explanation, and to learn from it. And if we can't interpret the explanation right away, we're scientifically literate enough to go out and find a quality answer in the literature somewhere and continue to learn from our mistakes. So we do have the basic tools we need to continue learning from our mistakes. And I say that knowing that my next slide is more research done by Bjork saying that unsuccessful retrieval attempts still enhance subsequent learning. Here's what he says about this. Tests can potentiate the effectiveness of subsequent study opportunities even under conditions that ensure learners will be incorrect on the test. In educational settings, students who are asked questions about a topic before they begin to study from it learn more from the subsequent study opportunity than do students who are shown the same questions but are not required to answer them. And it is important to note that such pre-questions are beneficial even if the student's initial answer is incorrect. Unsuccessful retrieval attempts followed by feedback led to more learning than did spending an equal amount of time studying the cue and the target together. What does this mean? It means you should be taking questions on subjects you haven't learned yet because you're still going to learn more effectively even if you get the answer wrong than you would if you just read the information and then started to practice. You simply don't have time to wait until you've learned every bit of material to start studying for this exam if you truly want to get an exceptional score. So yes, I know it's uncomfortable at first. I know you're going to get a lot of questions wrong at first doing systems that you haven't covered yet, but it is very important and it's still a highly efficacious method of studying despite your success or lack thereof on the practice questions right now. And this is more information about that. It essentially says students who are initially performing well and students who are initially performing poorly both improve by the testing effect rather than just reading the information alone. Here's some other quotes from some of his work that you can pause and read on your own if you'd like. Okay, so that was a lot. Let's put that theory into practice. I'm going to give you my final recommendations. Number 1, start early. That should be pretty obvious. But the earlier you start and the earlier you start to implement these methods, the better off you're going to be on the USMLE Step 1. The central method of your studying should be high volume practice questions. That has consistently been shown to improve performance come exam day. You should be doing these on random. Interleaving is better than blocked. However, you can use blocked practice as an adjunct to random practice if you desire. This is something I did. When I first started out, I had one question bank that I was performing on random, and I had another question bank that I was doing by system, and kind of going along with my course schedule. I liked this. It probably was more beneficial for apparent learning than my long-term success on Step 1. But it did help me perform on my in-class exams, and it gave me a little confidence with each system, although I still highly recommend consistently doing questions on random throughout your study schedules. Attempt subjects you haven't learned yet. Also very important. Whether you're performing well or whether you're performing poorly, whether you've seen a topic before, whether you haven't, you're still going to improve from practicing. It is still the most highly efficacious study method that we're currently aware of. Don't be discouraged by poor percentages. These will happen when you first start out. You don't start out scoring in the 80s and 90s on your practice questions. Don't be discouraged. Trust in the process and trust that you will improve, and this is truly the most beneficial study strategy. In reference to Anki, again, I didn't use it. But we've seen in that WashU study that it did correlate well with performance on Step 1. My final advice, based on that WashU study and some of the theory I talked about that, is that if you wish to do Anki, you should use it in addition to a high volume of practice questions. Anki is not a substitute for practice questions, but it can be beneficial on its own. So if it's something you're interested in, you should be doing it in addition to high volume of practice questions. Although, in my personal opinion, if you choose not to do Anki, you won't necessarily be at a disadvantage because you're still getting spaced repetition from random practice questions. You're still getting the testing effect, obviously. You're still getting those desirable difficulties to set you up for success on the exam. And first aid. I don't like the way information is presented. It's a lot of information without, in my mind, the necessary context to organize that information. But it was shown by the cohort of students at University of Michigan to significantly correlate with step 1 scores if you do it, if you pass through first aid 3 or more times as opposed to 2 or fewer times. So all I can really say about that is, based on the theory of learning, first aid would probably fall into the lower efficacy categories, but because it was shown to be successful, might be a good idea to use. Most of you are probably going to use it anyway. I would say I wouldn't worry about hitting that magic number of 3 passes. That's just the number they chose. I'm not sure if that's there's any significance behind that number other than that was the cutoff that showed significance. But again, if you choose not to use it or you choose not to use it that extensively, I don't think you'll be at a particular disadvantage because, like I said, you're still using the highest efficacy study strategies, that is, practice testing and spaced repetition. I would be interested to see if that study of Michigan students, if they did an extensive search for confounding variables, what they might find. But based on the study, it does seem that first aid is effective. So using it in addition to a high volume of practice questions might be beneficial. So those are my opinions in the least biased way I can give. The intent is for that to give you all the tools you need in addition to my personal advice to make an informed decision for yourself based on how you want to study. Practice questions are essential. Anki, first aid, probably pretty helpful, but you should be doing them in addition to practice questions. And unfortunately, other methods of study we don't have very good data on. And other than those 3, I would say you should be using whatever you're comfortable with in addition to the high efficacy methods. That's it.